It seems like no matter how old you are, you cannot escape problems when it comes to real estate. Because imagine being in a situation where you're older and retired or getting close to retirement, and you can't afford to sell your house, but you can't afford to keep it either. This is the situation that many people in this older demographic are finding themselves in, which is quite the conundrum. And on the flip side of the spectrum, you have young people today that can't figure out how to even buy a house because it's too expensive. How am I even going to get into this situation? And after hearing all this, maybe you don't even want to be a homeowner anymore because it can present you with a whole host of new challenges and problems as you get older. But I found this story that talked to several different homeowners who are kind of in this situation right now where they're at retirement age and they can't really afford to keep the house, but they can't really afford to buy another house. They talked to one woman here, 67 years old, and her plan was always to sell her 4-bedroom house in Parsippany, New Jersey to help support herself in retirement. And her plan was to save everything I can, and when I retire, move someplace cheap and use the equity in my house to buy a house in cash and reduce my costs. I think a lot of retirees have this game plan in mind. She bought the house in the year 2000 for $245,000 after her divorce, and the house just recently appraised for $700,000, so considerably more than what she paid for the house. And now she's looking for a house in the $400,000 to $450,000 range, but she hasn't had any luck finding anything suitable. She says that the homes that she's looked at would need a lot of work and are not in familiar neighborhoods. And she says that thinking that I'm going to spend the final years of my life in a worse situation than I've been in is just so depressing, especially when my friends are traveling all around the world with their spouses and constantly posting on Facebook which countries they're in. Well, I don't understand people like this either, because the reality is, if you want to be like your friends and be traveling the world, you could sell that house and live the expat nomadic lifestyle and do that. But the problem is, it sounds like she wants to stay close to her kids in New Jersey, and that's why she's trying to stay in the area and downsize, but isn't having any luck. So your friends that are out doing that obviously don't care about that, or they don't have any kids. So that's a sacrifice that they have to make if they do have kids, or the lifestyle choice that they made not to have any kids. But you can see even people in their late 60s and 70s have the FOMO. They see their friends out gallivanting and having fun and living the high life in retirement and traveling and going to all these different places, and they're like, man, I wish I could do that too. I wish that was me. But they feel kind of constrained by their family situation and feel obligated to stay close to family. So that's a tough choice that you have to make in retirement, because you might be able to sell that house and walk away with close to $500,000. That's probably why she's looking at a house in the $400,000 to $450,000 range. That's a lot of money you could use in retirement to go off gallivanting and enjoy going to all these different places. But the reason why she can't afford the life that she wants to live, which is staying close to her kids, is because New Jersey is obviously very expensive, just like almost everywhere is now, and not being able to find a suitable house is not working out for her. But the problem is too, just like most people, you have expectations that are too high. Maybe you shouldn't be looking for a house that's in the $400,000 range. Maybe you should be looking for something cheaper, a smaller condo, maybe even consider renting. There are ways to get around this. Sometimes people just don't think outside the box, which is why I thought it would be a good idea to make this video. And the reality is, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of costs involved with downsizing. Even though you might be making a lot of money off your home, interest rates are still sitting at around 7%. And actually just went up again after the most recent Fed rate cut, which is not a surprise, leaving a familiar home in a familiar neighborhood to buy something in an unfamiliar area and having potentially a higher payment than you would even have today, assuming you can't afford to pay cash, doesn't sound very appealing for people either. Here we have a house that has been on and off listed for rent ever since 2015. And when you look at the rental history here, $4,300 a month, $4,450 a month, $4,500 a month, and then up to a whopping $16,000 a month. Well, clearly nobody's paying that because it's been empty since November. And what do you notice? You notice on here that every single time it says listed for rent and it says listing removed, and it never shows you how much the house actually rented for. This is something that I've been noticing a lot here on my walks, and this is a trick and a tactic that real estate agents use that you need to be aware of, where they basically list the house for sale, list it for rent, and then they never put in the closed price. They never put what the closed sale price is. They never put the closed rental price. So you don't know what the comparable price is if you live in the neighborhood or if you're looking for something similar, first of all, but also you don't know what's a fair price to pay for a property like this. So when you see that, then you know, then the real estate agents in your area are playing games with the listings and not being fair or honest when reporting the data. They talked to another woman. She is 71. Her and her husband live in a single family home in Montreal, and they've lived there for 25 years. Similar to the last person, their options to downsize seem very limited due to the cost of these homes, and anything that they can afford is very old and needs a ton of repairs, or they're looking at expensive new condos. Those are like really the only options in their area. And they don't want to live in an expensive condo and not have a backyard, and they also don't want a big fixer-upper project either. So these retirees are looking at a situation where they just can't find anything that they like and can afford at the same time, but also paying for the cost of their current home is starting to become a burden as well. Also, there's other factors to this, like shrinking down your life. I mean, think about it. Anybody who's lived in a house for 25 years, you most likely have clutter. You have things piled up. You have a lot of things saved that are maybe decades old that people just hang on to. You know, typically, the bigger the house you get, the more stuff you end up hanging on to. It's just kind of human nature, right? So you also have to give up a lot of that. You have to give up a lot of your possessions to move into a smaller space, whether it is a house or a condo. That's an emotionally difficult thing to do. And a lot of people in this position are like, you know, I just can't see myself spending the rest of my life in a small apartment because I downsized. I don't know what they thought they were going to get when they're talking about downsizing. Maybe a lot of people who had this retirement plan, you know, had false hopes and things that they wanted to do that might have never really been possible, but they thought it might have been. This kind of reminds me of this thing that I figured out a while ago on my own through my own different life experiences, which is basically this, that the fantasy is almost always better than the reality with pretty much anything. You know, you can use your imagination there, but this pertains to dating, it pertains to women, it pertains to earning money, it pertains to, you know, how you see yourself in 10 years, it pertains to the vacation that you were hoping to have, everything. You have these fantasies and these ideas in your mind of how you want things to go, and then even if you're able to make it come true pretty close to the way you were hoping for, the fantasy was usually better than the reality. Once it actually happens, you realize that it's not really what you were hoping for. It's not all that it was cracked up to be. To me, it's actually kind of a disappointment and a depressing thing about life, but I've kind of just learned to accept it. And sometimes that's when it's nice to fantasize about different things, because you can keep that fantasy alive in your head, knowing that even if you were able to make that fantasy come true, it's probably not going to be as good as you think. So if you're able to put yourself into that mindset going into retirement, or having this idea that, hey, I thought I was going to downsize and do X, Y, and Z, and it turns out I can't, well, maybe that all these thoughts that you had about doing that were kind of blown out of proportion. Maybe you thought you were going to have this fantastic downsized, you know, cheaper retirement lifestyle and live happily ever after, but now you're realizing that that downsized lifestyle might not be so great. But the real trouble comes from where you want to downsize, but you actually can't afford to, but you also can't afford to keep the house, which is this last woman's scenario, okay? She's 60 years old. She lives in a single-story starter home in Sherman Oaks, California. She bought this 2-bedroom bungalow with her ex-partner in 1994 for $245,000, and she's lived there ever since. She hasn't made any major improvements, and she has a roommate to split the bills with. So according to Zillow, the Zestimate says her house is worth about $1.3 million, which is quite a big improvement from what she paid for the house, right? But now, at 60 years old, her income is quite a bit lower than she expected it to be at this point in life. The repair costs on this 75-year-old house have been creeping up. The HVAC system needs to be replaced. The pool and the large yard are expensive and energy intensive to maintain. She says, if I can't get a job that cover these bills, then I have to think about selling this house. But just like everybody else here, she's worried about not being able to find an affordable home in a neighborhood as pleasant as hers and as walkable as hers, especially on a budget that makes sense. I mean, if you're looking at staying in California, you might as well forget it, like that's the problem too. If you're a retiree in this situation or coming up on retirement and you think you're gonna have this same beautiful lifestyle you have on a lower dime in California, it's not going to happen. She's also worried about the capital gains taxes she's going to have to pay when she sells the house. But look at this woman's situation, right? She's basically in a situation where if she moves, she's going to have to make some major sacrifices in terms of her lifestyle, which a lot of people are not going to want to do, especially at that age. But she can't really afford to keep the house based on her current income. So she has two options. She can either sell the house and make that sacrifice, or she can basically live off the house, which is something that a lot of retirees choose to do. And living off the house, what I mean by that is you are taking out home equity loans or home equity lines of credit. Maybe you get a reverse mortgage and do that because there's a lot of equity built up in a house like that. And basically this house is now your retirement fund. But it also means that if something goes wrong during retirement, because your house is your retirement plan, and if something unexpected happens and for some reason you lose the house, now you also lose your retirement plan too. I think when people do this, it's definitely a riskier scenario to keep the house and live off of the house in retirement indefinitely, because what if you end up needing more money and you have nothing, but you still have this big expensive house to maintain and the costs keep creeping up? The house is very old, it's going to need more repairs in the future, versus selling the house, taking all that equity out, getting that $1 million out of the house, forcing yourself to downgrade to maybe a less desirable lifestyle, but much more attainable and affordable, and stretching that $1 million out until you die. I think that seems to be the most logical point of action, because then you're not stuck with this huge financial burden that is the house, which if you already can't afford it now at 60, how are you going to be able to afford to keep paying for it in 20 years when you're 80? So once again, people in this age group kind of have this delusion, right? They have this fantasy that I'm going to be able to do X, Y, and Z when I get to this stage in life, and it doesn't happen. And they're kind of at a loss. They don't really know what to do. Here's the moral of the story, and something for a lot of people to think about. Everybody wants to be a homeowner, right? Everybody wants to buy a house. People who are my age and younger are depressed that they're not able to buy a house that you like, and I'm never going to be able to afford a home, and I'm just going to doom spend into oblivion instead, is kind of like what a lot of people are doing. But if you fast forward a bit, and you look at people who are in this position that I was just talking about, and they also had a lot of advantages that you didn't have. A lot of these people are baby boomers. They grew up in a period of time that was basically the Goldilocks zone economically, right? You're living at a time where wages were outpacing inflation your entire adult life. The stock market basically was a nonstop bull market between now and the last 30 or 40 years, with a few hiccups here and there. Real estate market, the same thing. And buying those assets were attainable, when you were able to get ahead during this time frame. Whereas now, if you're a younger person trying to do the same, chances are you can't. Too expensive to buy a house. You're buying into the stock market today, but you're buying in at all-time high prices. And if there is a downturn, you're going to lose everything you invested, or at least a lot of it. And we might not see that next 30 or 40 years of growth like this generation did. In fact, there's a high probability that we won't. And so even this generation that had the best opportunities that life could give them in terms of ideal economic times are still having a hard time. They're still struggling to afford the house that they thought they were going to be able to afford as they got older. Or they're still struggling to have the lifestyle that they were hoping to have as they got older. They're finding out that it's too expensive to maintain these houses over the long run, like I've mentioned many times here on the channel before. Here's one for you. This house sold in 2020 for $610,000. They listed it for sale back in 2021, just a year later, for $3.3 million, increased the price in 2023 to $4.1 million, and then dropped it all the way back down to $2.995 million at the beginning of 2024. So the price of this house has been cut by a third over the past couple of years, and now it's sitting here for rent as well. They lowered the price even further later in the year of 2024 down to basically 2.8, and now they're back up to $3 million. And the rental price is sitting at $13,500 a month. Nothing but playing games, houses sitting empty, plenty of empty houses out there for people to live in. Problem is, no one can afford this. And you know, I just showed you this house, guys. Like, imagine how expensive it is to maintain a house like that. You know, imagine you are somebody in your mid-30s or early 40s and you can afford a house like that. Do you really think that you're gonna be able to afford to pay for this house when you're in your 70s or 80s? You know, when you have to come up with $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a month because of how much the maintenance costs and expenses have gone up for this house? Are you gonna be able to maintain that lifestyle? Probably not. So the moral of the story is you probably shouldn't be aiming for that lifestyle now if it's something that's not going to be attainable or sustainable long term. And you can also look at it like this. These people are lucky they even have a house to begin with. They have the house to sell and they do have options. They're just being stubborn with their options, which is true. But they're also finding out the hard way now that they're basically almost 70 years old, that even though you were able to get that house and you can sell it for a nice chunk of change today, that chunk of change is not going to go nearly as far as they thought it would going into 2025. And I have a feeling people in our generation who try to have the same ambitions later on are going to end up in the same situation. The whole promise of work hard and you'll be able to retire and sail off into the sunset is just a dream. In many cases now. It's not really a reality. In fact, I made a whole video about that yesterday, so check that out if you missed it. And since we mostly talked about real estate in this video, I want to move over to something else real quick that was sent to me, because as the real estate market continues to remain tight and home sales remain at 30-year lows, you're starting to see some real cracks form in the system, particularly when it comes to real estate agents and real estate companies. There is a real estate brokerage firm in Massachusetts called Success Real Estate, and they were in business for 32 years. Even we're talking about how we sold billions of dollars in real estate over the past 5 years, and now all of a sudden they just announced that they're going to be closing down. They're not going to be accepting any new business. This could even possibly be an embezzlement type of situation. It's not even just a tough times in real estate situation. It could be actually where the owner of the company decided to steal a bunch of money, another FTX-like situation. And this would be very easy to do owning a real estate firm, because think about the level of escrow deposits you have to collect. You know, sometimes you could have millions of dollars sitting in escrow, especially if you're selling billions of dollars worth of real estate, and that money is supposed to remain in that escrow account untouched until whatever happens to the money is supposed to happen. If it's a deposit, it goes towards the purchase. If the purchase falls apart, a lot of times it gets refunded. If it's money sitting there waiting to close on the property, then it's money that needs to sit there until the sale closes, and then it's transferred to the title company. So the money is supposed to be just sitting there, and if it's gone, this is going to be a big disaster for everybody involved. It's theft on a massive scale. If they're already talking about this in the news, then most likely that's what the case is. It's not like, oh, we just fell on hard times in real estate. But what you can also learn from this, when times get tough, when things get desperate, people turn to desperate measures and do things they wouldn't ordinarily do out of desperation. This is the perfect example. So hopefully everybody who was working a deal with this real estate firm is going to be able to get their money back. But if it was in fact stolen, I wouldn't hold your breath. Another big real estate story that happened over the past couple of days is how the CEO of Lennar came out and talked about how, listen, home prices need to come down. There's no two ways about it, which is basically an admission that this economy is not good. People can't afford the homes, even with all the incentives and programs that home builders are giving to home buyers. And it also goes to show you, even though you're a big shot at a big home building company like Lennar, you don't really understand how the economy works, because this is something that he says. He's like, look, in the course of our fourth quarter, the housing market appeared to be improving as the Fed cut short-term interest rates, which proved to be more challenging as mortgage rates rose almost 100 basis points through the quarter. So We've seen mortgage rates go up ever since the Fed starts cutting rates, and guys like this are surprised, whereas this is their business, this is their line of work. They should know how this goes by now, but apparently they don't. They need people like me on YouTube to explain it to them, that the mortgage rates are not driven by what the Fed does. The mortgage rates are driven by the 10-year Treasury market, and ever since the Fed has been cutting rates, the 10-year Treasury market has been on the rise because people who buy those 10-year Treasuries don't believe a word the Fed says about inflation being tamed, and all the latest economic data reflects that as well. So it looks like moving into 2025, the only way these home builders are going to continue to be able to sell homes is to continue with these incentives. And the problem is, like Lennar, many of the home builders are losing a lot of money on these incentives to continue selling these houses. So what are they going to do? Subsidize the housing market and keep selling these homes at a loss? It's not going to be very good for their shareholders or their stock price. So I don't know why they would consider that a good idea long term. But going back to what I said at the beginning of this video, what this shows you is everybody's experiencing problems with real estate right now. Young home buyers that wish they could be a home buyer that can't afford a home. Old homeowners that are trapped in their house because of not being able to fulfill their fantasy or not being able to have the lifestyle they were hoping to have in retirement. Home builders that are basically subsidizing the brand new housing market right now just to be able to sell their homes, which is completely unsustainable. Which is why I've been telling people on this channel, when you combine those things with the fact that we're seeing a massive amount of layoffs right now, the jobs just aren't there to maintain this level of price stability in the housing market, you're going to see a decline on some level. By how much and where, we just don't know. But what I do know is that this current situation we are in is completely unsustainable, and it just can't last forever. So if you're somebody who's younger right now and you're frustrated and you can't buy a house, maybe it's time to reevaluate how you see your life when you're in your 60s or 70s and see if this is even the real life plan that you want to have for yourself anyways. Maybe you want to be like that other lady who's out traveling in different countries and being a nomad and an expat in your 60s and 70s and living cheaply in another country. Maybe that's you. But it definitely should give you some things to think about as you see that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Even if you did everything right and you made it to retirement age and you own that house, now that house can just be a huge anchor for you not to be able to really live the life you want to live. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.